Imagine the calendar frozen in the year 1989. Tehran is still in shock from the events of the past few days. The streets are crowded, people are talking about the future, and no one really knows what is about to happen next. One huge question hangs over everyone's head. What happens now? Now imagine that at that very critical moment in history, just one different decision was made. Just one vote. Just one choice. And the person we know today as the supreme leader of Iran never reached that position. What do you think Iran would look like today? At first glance, it might seem like a simple question, but what's fascinating is that sometimes the fate of an entire country is shaped not by massive wars or great revolutions, but by a decision made inside a single room. Tonight, we're going to get into a time machine. But not to see the past. We're going to visit a past that never happened. We're about to enter a world where everything changes from one specific moment onward. Like those movies where the main character makes a different choice and the entire story takes a completely different direction. In this story, we're not here to judge who would have been better or worse. We're simply going to follow one fascinating question. If history had taken a slightly different turn at that critical moment, where would we be today? Maybe different names would have filled the history books. Maybe some events would never have happened. Maybe other events would have happened much sooner. Maybe Iran's relationship with the rest of the world would have followed a completely different path. Maybe the economy would have developed in another direction. Maybe even the daily lives of millions of people would have been different. But this is where the story becomes even more interesting. Most people think history is a straight line. Something happens and the outcome is inevitable. The reality is much different. History is more like a giant crossroads. At every crossroads, there are dozens of possible roads. We only lived through one of them. But what about the others? The roads that could have existed but never got the chance? Today, we're going to imagine one of those roads. We're going to pull back the curtain of reality for a few moments and look at a world where one historic decision never took place. In that world, newspaper headlines are different. Speeches are different. Maybe some of the political figures we know today never rise to power. Maybe certain rivalries never form. Maybe some alliances never come into existence. And perhaps, most importantly, maybe the Iran we know today has a completely different face. But before we step into this parallel world, there's one thing we need to remember. History isn't a video game where you can hit the reset button and see what happens. Nobody knows what would have actually happened. All we have are clues, hints, the people who were present at the time, the decisions that were on the table, and the possibilities that could have shaped the future. So if you're ready, buckle up, because we're about to enter one of the most fascinating what-if scenarios in modern Iranian history. A question you've probably asked yourself before, but never had the chance to explore deeply. What if Khomeini had never become Iran's supreme leader? What would Iran look like today? Well, now that we've stepped into this parallel world, let's go a little further. Let's move the clock ahead a few minutes. The meeting is over. People are leaving the room. Journalists are waiting outside. Everyone wants to know who is about powerful. Some disappear from the political stage. and some never even make it into the spotlight. Strange, isn't it? How the fate of certain individuals can depend on a decision that took only a few minutes. But the story is just getting started. Because when the leader of a country changes, it's not just one person who changes. The entire equation changes. The game changes. Even players who haven't entered the field yet are affected. It's like a line of dominoes. Once the first piece falls, the rest begin to move. Maybe in this world, Iran's relationships with certain countries develop differently. Maybe some tensions become less severe. Maybe some tensions become even greater. Nobody knows. But what we do know is that the personalities of leaders can influence the direction of history. One leader is more willing to take risks. Another is more cautious. One prefers negotiation. Another prefers confrontation. And those differences can shape the future of multiple generations. Now imagine many years have passed. A new generation has been born. Some of you watching this video right now may not have even been born at that time. But what's fascinating is that a decision made decades ago can still affect the lives of millions today. This is where history becomes almost frightening. Because you realize that the future of an entire nation may have depended on just a few critical hours. And perhaps even more surprising is that the people living through those moments had no idea they were witnessing one of the most important chapters in their country's history. But let's make things a little more controversial. Imagine walking down the street today and asking 100 people, what if that historic decision had gone differently? Would Iran be better off today or worse? How many different answers do you think you'd hear? Probably 100, because there is no definitive answer. Some people would say everything would have been better. Others would argue things would have become more difficult. And some would say almost nothing would have changed. That's exactly what makes this topic so fascinating. No one can turn on a time machine and see the real answer. All we can do is speculate. All we can do is place different scenarios side by side, like a detective trying to solve an old case decades later. But there's another interesting point. Many people believe leaders alone create history. The truth is much more complicated than that. Leaders matter. But nations are not built by a single person. Millions of people influence a country's destiny at the same time. Workers, students, business owners, politicians, journalists, and even people whose names will never appear in history books. That's why, perhaps, the real question isn't what would have happened if that decision had never been made. Perhaps the real question is how many different futures were possible for Iran, and why we ended up on this particular path. Maybe history is like a massive highway, a road with hundreds of exits. We only took one of them. But the exits we never took continue to capture people's imagination. They continue to raise questions. They continue to spark debates, and they probably will for many years to come. So whenever you think about that historic day, remember this. Sometimes a decision that takes only a few minutes can shape the destiny of several generations. And maybe that's why people still talk about that moment after all these years. A moment that could have sent history down an entirely different road.